The story begins with a man named Nick, who had been stranded for days in the icy mountains of the Arctic. He had almost no resources left and was struggling to survive any way he could. The temperature in the Arctic mountains drops to extreme levels, often falling far below 0 Celsius, especially in winter. A human body can only endure a certain limit of cold, and anything beyond that means death. This shows just how harsh Nick's situation really was. A few days earlier, he had been flying over the Arctic with his friends when their plane suddenly crash-landed due to a malfunction. All of his companions died in the crash, only Nick survived, and he had been there alone for a week. The little food and supplies he had were already gone, so he dug a small hole in the ice to catch fish, preserving them to keep himself alive. Luckily, he managed to ration the fish because he didn't know how long he would be stuck there. He also had a small device that could send signals if picked up by any passing plane or helicopter, but so far, no one had responded. Still, Nick held on to hope that one day a rescue team would come and save him. One day, as he returned to the wrecked plane following his routine, he noticed that the fish he had stored were gone. Shocked, he thought another survivor was stealing his food, but his suspicion vanished when he saw large polar bear tracks in the snow. Terrified, Nick rushed back into the wreckage, realizing that now he would also have to face the deadly threat of a polar bear. Despite everything, Nick kept following survival techniques and ideas, hoping to make it through. After nearly 2 weeks, as he kept cranking his signal machine, the light suddenly turned green, meaning a plane or helicopter was nearby. Excited, he searched the snowy skies and finally spotted a helicopter. He quickly lit a flare, waving it to get attention. Fortunately, the helicopter crew saw him and started to descend to rescue him. Nick was overjoyed, certain his ordeal was about to end. But as the helicopter attempted to land, a snowstorm intensified, making it impossible to control. Within moments, the helicopter crashed violently into the ground. Horrified, Nick ran to help. The wreckage was scattered, and when he opened the door, he discovered the pilot was already dead. However, a woman inside was still alive, though unconscious. Nick pulled her out and carried her to the safety of his crashed plane, knowing he couldn't leave her to die in the freezing wasteland. Now, what was supposed to be a rescue had turned into another tragedy, 1 life lost and 2 people trapped in the deadly Arctic. Nick did his best to revive the woman, who slowly opened her eyes, but soon they both realized they couldn't even understand each other's language. Nick tried to communicate through gestures, reassuring the woman that he would take care of everything. She had a severe injury on her stomach, which Nick carefully stitched up. She was extremely weak, so she went to rest. At that moment, Nick felt overwhelmed with guilt, believing all of this had happened because of him. If he hadn't called for help, the helicopter wouldn't have crashed. But what was done couldn't be undone, and now he had the responsibility of looking after her. From the wreckage, Nick salvaged everything he could, and fortunately, he found a map of the Arctic mountains. He also gathered useful supplies, including a small device for heating food. That discovery made him happy, since until then he had been eating raw fish and cold food. Now, for the first time, he could finally eat something warm. Among the wreckage, Nick also found a photograph of the woman with the pilot who had died in the crash, and between them stood their son, showing they were a family. The thought hit Nick hard, but he knew he couldn't dwell on what couldn't be changed. His only focus now was to survive and get the woman to safety. He studied the map and realized there was a tourist point far away where helicopters occasionally arrived. If he could somehow reach that location with the woman, there was hope for rescue. The challenge was that the route was extremely long, through harsher mountains and even colder temperatures. Still, staying in one place wasn't an option. Nick rationed food and prepared supplies for the journey. He even left notes in the wreckage, so if rescuers came, they would know where he had gone. Since the woman was too weak to walk, he placed her on a sled, covering her completely, and began pulling her himself. It was going to be an enormous journey, and Nick had no idea if they would survive it. Yet deep inside, he felt a spark of hope. He was determined to save the woman, even more than himself. After all, because of him, her entire family had been destroyed, and now she was trapped here with him. Without wasting another thought, Nick started dragging the sled forward, constantly stopping to check for danger, because polar bears could be lurking anywhere, always waiting for the chance to attack. Nick kept moving forward with the woman, but the entire process was exhausting him. Walking through the deep snow slowed his pace so much that if he continued like this, it would take him months to reach the destination. Still, he pushed on, determined to save her life. He carried the guilt of her husband's death, knowing that because of him, her entire family had been destroyed. When Nick checked the map, he realized they had only covered a small distance and still had weeks of travel left to reach the rescue point. In such harsh conditions, anyone could die without anyone ever knowing. Even so, Nick didn't stop, he kept going. The woman understood, at least, that he was trying to help her, but her body was too weak to contribute. Nick himself was exhausted and constantly on alert for polar bear attacks. Polar bears were always lurking, waiting for prey. To make matters worse, Nick had almost no fish left, and he didn't know how he would feed both himself and the woman. As night began to fall, the temperature dropped far below zero, forcing Nick to build an igloo. Digging quickly, he made a small snow chamber, placed the woman inside, and prepared food for both of them. In such conditions, hope was vital, yet Nick often felt it slipping away, except for the crushing guilt that kept him alive. He knew that without that guilt, he might have already given up. They survived the night, and in the morning Nick studied the map again before continuing the journey. His food supplies were running dangerously low, just a few fish and some noodles left. The problem was that now food had to be shared between two people instead of one, and it was depleting fast. Ignoring the risk, Nick kept pulling the sled forward. After some time, he noticed on the map that they needed to move straight ahead, but in front of them stood a small mountain. He realized he could climb it himself, but pulling the woman up would be nearly impossible. Looking carefully, he discovered an alternate path around the mountain that reconnected to the main route. The problem was that this detour would add several extra days to the already long journey. With limited supplies, that could mean certain death from starvation, even if they avoided predators. Despite the risk, Nick decided to attempt pulling her up the mountain. He tied a rope and climbed to the top to test the slope. Slowly, with great effort, he reached the summit and began pulling the woman up with the rope. It took every ounce of strength he had, but he didn't stop. However, the freezing cold had coated the rope in ice, and as he strained to pull, his numb hand slipped. The rope suddenly tore free from his grip. Nick watched helplessly as the rope slipped from his frozen hands and the woman tumbled back down to the spot where he had first tried to haul her up. His heart sank. He realized he could never drag her over the mountain like this. As much as he wanted the faster route, he had no choice but to take the longer path, even though it would add several days to their already deadly journey. Supplies were running dangerously low, but Nick refused to abandon her. He was determined to save her no matter what. With a heavy heart, he lifted the woman back onto the sled and began pulling her toward the alternate path. Hours passed. Each step through the thick snow felt like he was carrying the weight of the world. His muscles screamed, his lungs burned from the icy air, and the bitter cold gnawed at every inch of exposed skin. The woman was no better, her body was pale and numb, her wounds worsening. Without proper treatment, Nick knew she wouldn't last much longer. But giving up wasn't an option. But now, with the woman's life on the line, he couldn't afford delays. The only option was to keep moving. By nightfall, exhaustion consumed him. He couldn't build another igloo, it would take hours, and his strength was nearly gone. Instead, he scanned the frozen wilderness for shelter. The only choice was risky, finding a cave, likely carved out by polar bears. It was a gamble, but survival left no room for comfort. After a desperate search, he spotted a small hollow between jagged rocks. He pushed the woman inside first, then dragged their supplies in and tried to cover the entrance with snow and ice. For now, it would have to do. Inside, the cave was dark and eerily silent. Nick quickly fired up the heating stove to warm their last scraps of food. He fed the woman and forced down a few bites himself. But a new fear crept in, the gas canister was nearly empty. Soon, there would be no way to cook their food or boil snow for water. That realization sank into him like a stone. Their situation was about to get much worse. As he tried to settle in, a deep, guttural growl echoed from the cave's entrance. Nick froze. His blood ran cold. He didn't need to see it to know, a polar bear had returned to claim its den. Slowly, its massive white head pushed through the shadows, its black eyes fixed on him and the woman. Terror surged through Nick. If the bear attacked, they were finished. In a frantic move, he grabbed a flare from his pack, struck it, and thrust the burning light forward. The cave lit up with a red glow as sparks hissed and smoke curled. The polar bear flinched, confused and startled by the sudden fire in its face. Nick waved the flare wildly, shouting, pushing the light closer. The bear snarled, its hot breath steaming in the frozen air, but finally, with a frustrated roar, it turned and lumbered back into the night. Nick's hands trembled as the flare burned out. His heart pounded so hard he thought it would burst. He knew the bear wasn't gone for good. Polar bears never gave up their territory. Tonight, it had retreated, but it would come back. He sat in the darkness, wide awake, eyes fixed on the cave's mouth, clutching his last flares like lifelines. Fear held him prisoner until dawn, leaving him exhausted, but still alive. At sunrise, Nick stepped cautiously outside, scanning the frozen horizon for danger before pulling out both the woman and his remaining supplies. He knew the same exhausting routine lay ahead: follow the map, drag her sled, and push through endless miles of brutal white wilderness. The absence of polar bears in the area gave him a moment of relief, so he grabbed hold of the woman and forced himself onward toward the rescue point. But his strength was draining fast, his body had little energy left, and dragging not just himself but another half-conscious human across deep snow was breaking him apart. Just when he thought things couldn't get worse, the sky shifted. A violent snowstorm began to roar in from the distance, icy winds blasting so hard they pushed Nick backward step by step. Acting fast, he flipped a small overturned boat for shelter and pressed himself and the woman against its side. The storm raged for hours, slamming against them with merciless force, burying them deeper under snow. When the howling finally died down, Nick was barely conscious. Snow had sealed them in, trapping them beneath layers of ice. With sheer will, he clawed his way out and dragged the woman free. But when he tried to wake her, there was no response, her breaths were faint, her chest barely moving. Then blood trickled from her mouth. Panic surged through Nick as he pulled back her layers of clothing, revealing the wound in her abdomen. Infection had spread across the entire area. Out here, with no medicine, no antibiotics, no real chance of treatment, it was inevitable that the wound would worsen until it killed her. The thought crushed him. He realized with brutal clarity that keeping her alive might be impossible, and worse, by trying, he could doom himself as well. The logical choice was to leave her behind, to continue the journey alone. The practical part of Nick's mind screamed at him, if you keep dragging her, you'll both die out here. His body was already failing, and yet his heart refused to release its grip on hope. With tears stinging his frozen eyes, he gently eased the woman down against a jagged stone outcrop. From the inside pocket of her coat, he pulled out a photograph, her family, smiling in a world that no longer existed. He placed it in her trembling hand, whispering softly that maybe, in her final moments, she could picture being with them once again. His chest clenched with guilt. Deep down, he knew the truth, her husband had died because of him. Her family had been destroyed because of him. And now, when she needed him most, he was walking away. His heart screamed for him to stay, but survival demanded otherwise. With a heaviness that nearly crushed him, Nick forced himself forward, pulling the sled alone toward the distant rescue point. But fate had no intention of letting him go so easily. Within minutes, his boot punched straight through what looked like solid snow. The ground caved beneath him, revealing a hidden ice pit. He plummeted down, slamming onto jagged rocks concealed in the frozen dark. White-hot pain exploded up his leg as the unmistakable crack of breaking bone echoed in his ears. He screamed, clutching at the injury, snowflakes stinging his face as if mocking his weakness. The Arctic was full of such death traps, concealed pits that swallowed men whole, never to return. Normally, one tested each step with a stick. But Nick had been too drained, too distracted, too consumed by guilt. Now it might cost him his life. Lying in that icy tomb, pain flooding every nerve, a horrible thought struck him. Maybe this was punishment. Maybe he wasn't meant to leave her behind. Maybe even God was forcing him back. Her family had perished because of him, and now she was following them into the grave. Fueled by sheer desperation, Nick clawed his way out of the pit, dragging his shattered body inch by inch until he reached the surface. Every movement sent fire shooting through his leg, but he refused to stop. Stumbling, half-crawling, he made his way back across the snow. And when he finally reached the place where he had left her, his heart nearly stopped. She was alive. Barely, faint as a dying flame, but alive. The sight crushed him, shattered him, and yet filled him with fierce determination. Right there, in that frozen wasteland, Nick swore to himself, never again. No matter what happened, no matter the cost, he would not abandon her. Binding himself to the sled, splinting his broken leg as best he could, Nick jammed a stick into the ice and began pushing forward. Every thrust sent agony through his body. Every step felt like a war he was losing. But his will to survive, and hers, was stronger than the pain. Hours blurred into days. Snowstorms swallowed the horizon. Time became meaningless, reduced to the sound of his labored breaths and the endless scrape of sled runners against ice. Yet somehow, impossibly, he kept moving. He dragged her across the frozen wilderness, following the map, clinging to hope with bloodied hands and fractured bones. At last, the jagged outline of the rescue point appeared. They had made it. Against all odds, they had made it. But when Nick reached the base of the steep mountain that marked the signal station, a cruel reality set in. The only way to alert rescuers was from the summit. And climbing it, in his condition, seemed impossible. Still, he had no choice. Exhausted beyond reason, he tried hauling the woman upward, but his broken body gave out after only a few feet. He collapsed, chest heaving, muscles refusing to obey. With no strength left, he laid her gently at the mountain's base, whispering a promise that he would return. Then, gripping the rocks with torn fingers, Nick began his climb alone. Every step drained what little life remained in him. Every movement felt like it might be his last. But higher and higher he went, until at last, the summit opened before him, and on the horizon, a miracle appeared. A helicopter. Exhaustion tore through every muscle in Nick's body. He tried once more to drag the injured woman up the slope, but his strength finally gave out. His arms failed, his knees buckled, and the sled refused to move another inch. With no choice left, he eased her against the icy rock and whispered a promise before turning toward the climb alone. Every step up the mountain drained the last drops of his strength. His fingers clawed at the frozen stone, his broken leg screamed with every shift of weight, but he forced himself onward. And then, through the haze of pain and snow, a miracle appeared. For the first time in days, hope surged in his chest. Trembling, Nick pulled the flare from his pack, struck it, and held it high. The red glow burned against the pale horizon as he waved it desperately, screaming into the endless sky, praying the crew would see him. But the aircraft didn't turn. Its path remained steady, as if blind to his frantic signal. Refusing to surrender, Nick stumbled back down the treacherous slope, nearly collapsing from fatigue. Gritting his teeth against the agony, he hooked the sled once more to his broken body and dragged the woman upward, inch by agonizing inch. The climb was torture, his vision blurred, his breath rattled in shallow bursts, but finally, somehow, he pulled her to the summit. The helicopter was still there, hovering in the distance. For a brief, flickering moment, hope reignited. Nick shouted until his throat tore, his voice breaking into the wind. But the sound was swallowed whole by the vast emptiness of the Arctic, lost before it could ever reach the crew. His body trembled violently, skin burning from cold. And then, in one last desperate act, Nick stripped off his protective suit, the only barrier between him and the killing frost. He doused it, set it alight, and tied it to a stick, hoisting the torch high into the sky. Flames roared upward, wild and defiant, dancing against the blinding white of snow and ice. For a moment, it seemed to work. The fire blazed, a beacon in the endless wasteland. But then, horror. The helicopter banked away, disappearing behind the mountains. Nick's heart shattered. He collapsed into the snow beside the woman, pulling her frail body close against his chest. Salvation had been within reach, but it had slipped away. With no strength left, he whispered broken prayers into the frozen wind. If death was inevitable, then he would not face it alone. He would meet it beside her. Time seemed to stop. The silence pressed in. And then, movement. Not a bear. Not a trick of the storm. The helicopter. Returning. At first, he thought it was a cruel hallucination. But then the sound grew louder, real, undeniable, the rescue team circling back, having finally spotted the desperate beacon of fire. Relief surged through Nick, overwhelming, almost unbearable. Tears cut hot paths down his frozen face as he realized they were saved. Soon, both he and the woman would be lifted from this frozen grave, carried to safety, and she would finally receive the medical care she so desperately needed. Nick, who had carried the weight of guilt and loss, who had endured unimaginable suffering, had not let her die alone. He had stayed. And now, against every odd, they had been granted a second chance. It was proof of something greater, that when humans are pushed past every limit, when survival seems impossible, miracles still find a way. And with that, their story reached its end.